Picture this. You step out into your garden excited to finally harvest some squash, only to find that it's mysteriously wilted and dying. If that sounds familiar, your garden was probably visited by the #1 gardening villain, the squash vine borer, also known as SVB for short. I'm Meg, and my North Carolina garden has been battling these guys since day one. And after years of going to war with them, I've finally cracked the code on how to keep my squash alive and flourishing. So today I'm gonna be opening up my SVB survival playbook and sharing it with you all. And we're gonna dive deep into the world of these evil little pests, from finding their eggs all the way up to performing an emergency squash surgery. We are in the thick of July, right at the peak of squash vine borer season. So whether you're an experienced gardener or a newbie just trying to grow some squash in a borer infested area, this guide is for you. So what is the squash vine borer? It's actually just a moth. Doesn't sound or look very sinister at all, but don't worry, it is. It's easily identifiable in its adult form because it has this bright traffic cone orange thorax. And once you see it, you'll never forget what it looks like. The squash vine borer is not found everywhere in the world. So if you've never encountered this pest before, consider yourselves extremely lucky. It is found in North America, and its range extends from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Midwest, and it goes as far south as Texas and Florida, and they seem to particularly love the South. It can sometimes be found out west, but it's not very common at all, and this is why Kevin and Jacques are able to grow squash so effortlessly out in California. I'm clearly not jealous at all. The host plant for the squash vine borer, meaning what its larva eats, are your cucurbits. So anything in the Cucurbitaceae family. They most commonly attack your squash, your pumpkins, and your gourds, and kind of less commonly will attack your cucumbers and your melons, but they do attack them. I actually have a cucumber vine that is dying right now from squash vine borer. The squash vine borer kills your squash like a horror movie. So the borer will lay its egg on the stem of your squash. That egg will hatch. The larva, which looks like this nasty little grub thing, it bores down into the stem of your squash, and it begins to eat your squash from the inside out. It eats and eats and eats until it becomes an adult, where it flies out of your squash and it just goes on to continue the cycle. The reason that they're so lethal and how they just seem to kill your plants overnight is because they're extremely hard to catch at an early stage. Once that egg hatches and it bores down into the stem of your squash, it's really hard to see any physical evidence that it's there until your plant just kind of starts wilting out of nowhere. The only evidence that we can see that a squash vine borer has been there is if we're looking really, really hard, like meticulously hard. And that's really hard to do, especially if you have a lot of squash plants. If you are looking, you're gonna wanna look for the eggs. And the eggs look very similar to squash bug eggs, which is a totally different insect. But squash bug eggs, they will lay these tiny brown eggs, and usually in a cluster of multiple eggs, and they'll usually be found on the leaf, like usually the underside of the leaf of your squash. Whereas with squash vine borer eggs, they look the exact same, but it's usually just one singular egg. It doesn't seem like they're ever really laid in clusters, and usually they're found on the stem of your squash. Now, if the egg is already hatched and the larva has bored into the stem of the squash, you will see a little hole with some yellow frass coming out, and frass is just caterpillar poop. The second that you plant your squash seeds in the ground, you should be doing this every single day, and that is just doing a little bit of seek and destroy with the eggs. Come out to your pumpkin patch or your squash tunnel like I'm standing under right now, and every day just look over the vines and see if you see any eggs, and if you see them, just use your thumb, squish them, remove them, whatever you want to do to just get them off of that stem. This method is worth the effort, but it's not going to be 100% effective because those eggs are really tiny. They're really hard to see, especially if you're growing a lot of plants, especially if you're growing on the ground. It's just gonna make it that much harder, and you're likely to miss a few eggs. Another method you can do is you can bury the stem of your squash underneath the soil. And this can work for those of you that have the space to do so. Maybe you're growing your squash along the ground anyway. I tried this one year and it did not work for me. I found that I would have to completely bury the entire plant underneath the soil to stop the squash vine borer, because what'll happen is if they can't reach the main stem, they'll lay an egg on the petiole of one of the leaves, and then the larva will munch its way down to the main stem anyway. So it's worth a try if you need to do it. And there are other benefits to burying your stems as well. It allows your plant to root itself along the ground. That way, if squash vine borer attacks one part of the main stem, it may still survive because it's continued to root itself. Another common method that people use is to wrap your stems with something like aluminum foil or burlap or whatever you can think of to create a physical barrier between the squash vine borer and your stems. I think that this could work for someone that's maybe a balcony gardener. Maybe you have 1 or 2 plants that you're just watching like a hawk. I think maybe it could work for you, but let's be honest, for those of us that are growing a ton of plants, it's just really impractical, it's wasteful, and it's just not gonna work. Another thing that you can try is to do some injections. I once had a friend visit me and ask me why I kept a box of these needles in my greenhouse, and I was like, listen, I know what it looks like, but it's not what it looks like. You can use these to inject BT into the vines of your squash, and BT stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, and it is a bacteria that is effective at killing caterpillars like the squash vine borer larva, and it's considered an organic option. This can be extremely effective if caught early enough. When you're looking over your vines and you see a little hole with the frass coming out, you can just inject a little bit of BT right into the vine, and it seems to work pretty well, but again, it's not 100% effective because by the time you notice that frass, you really have no idea where the larva is in the vine, but you can take some guesses and just give this a try. One common thing I see people do with BT is they spray their plants with BT, and this is just not effective. BT is only going to be effective against caterpillars. It is not going to kill the eggs, and once those eggs hatch, those borers, they go straight to work. They immediately bore into the vine. So spraying your plants with BT is just not going to be effective, and it can be harmful to other caterpillars. Like myself, I raise swallowtails and monarchs in my garden. So if you're also raising caterpillars, BT is something that you do not want to spray in your garden. The most surefire way to treat squash vine borer is by physically removing the larva from the vine yourself by performing a squash vine surgery, also what I like to call a borectomy. I very unfortunately found one of my plants this morning that needed a borectomy, and how I knew it needed one was at the very base of the plant where it comes out of the soil. That is a place that vine borers like to attack. I saw the yellow frass, and I also saw that it was kind of cracking, like it just looked diseased. So I decided to go in. For my surgical equipment, I like to just use like a nail kit. It's got these tiny little scissors in here that are really great. They're small enough that you don't really run the risk of accidentally severing the entire vine. You can be really precise with these. And then a pair of tweezers to remove the grub and kind of help open up the vine a little bit as well. You're gonna make an incision along the vine where you think the borer might be, and you're gonna kind of use some tweezers to just gently open up the cut. Be very careful to not completely cut your vine in half. That's not gonna be good, your vine's gonna die. You just wanna make pretty much like a hole to open it up and grab the borer. Once you see the grub, take your tweezers, pull it out, dispose of it however you want to. I just kind of give it to my chickens. Once you have removed the borer, you're done. You want to let the cut callus over really well for the next few days, and then you can kind of choose to leave it as is, or you can protect it somehow if you want. I've seen people use bandages or band-aids to protect it. It just depends on what you want to do. And as long as there wasn't a lot of significant damage done to the vine, it should continue to live and pump out lots of squash, but that's unfortunately not always the case. Sometimes it will still die, but at least we've done everything that we could possibly do. This method is extremely effective if caught at the right time, but it also can be really exhausting, especially if you have a lot of plants and you have a large problem. Last year, I spent countless hours performing surgeries out here like I was a real life surgeon. And it's funny because I got a whole pre-med degree thinking that I was gonna be a real life surgeon, but instead I'm just out here performing borectomies on my squash plants. It's just funny how life works like that. Now, there is a way to prevent ever having to deal with these pests in the first place. You know that saying, prevention is the best medicine? It applies here too. So let's talk about how to prevent these guys altogether. There are many different species in the Cucurbitaceae family, but the three most common ones are Cucurbita pepo, and these are gonna be your typical summer squash, like your straight neck yellow squash, your black beauty zucchini, your patty pan squash. And then we have Cucurbita maxima, and these are gonna be a lot of our winter squashes, and think your big Cinderella pumpkins, those are usually Cucurbita maxima. And then we have Cucurbita machata, and this is the species you wanna look out for when you are buying your seeds if you have a squash vine borer problem, because this species is extremely resistant to the squash vine borer. The reason that Cucurbita machata is so resistant to SVB is because typically those varieties have much tougher and thinner stems, so it just makes it physically harder for those borers to bore through. If you are just dead set on planting some Cucurbita pepo, like your yellow squash and your zucchini, the summer squash that we all know and love, myself included, here's another little trick that you can do to prevent the borers. You can wait until later in the season, the end of July, early August, to plant them, because by the end of July, the squash vine borer is gonna be slowing down on its egg laying cycle, and it's gonna completely stop around the middle of August, just depending on where you live. So that's kind of a way to get around their life cycle a little bit. Again, it's not 100% effective because these things are extremely persistent, but it's worth a try. And I tried this last year and I did get a decent harvest of some summer squash this way. Now this is the golden tip of the video, because this is what finally allowed me to grow squash successfully after trying for 3 whole years. And all it took was just planting the right variety. There are so many different varieties of Cucurbita machata, but I'm gonna introduce you to 2 of my favorites today. The first one being Seminole Pumpkin. The way that this squash just laughs in the face of not only squash vine borer, but squash bugs and powdery mildew as well. It makes this a southern gardener's dream, and it makes sense because it is named after Seminole, Florida, where it was created. And I feel like if anything can grow in Florida, it can pretty much grow anywhere. I highly recommend this one. Another one of my favorites that I'll probably grow until the day that I die is the trombetta squash. This is for sure a conversation piece in the garden, and not only does it look very unique, it's highly resistant to SVB and also squash bugs and powdery mildew. And it's really versatile because if you can't grow your summer squash because of SVB, don't worry, this not only acts as a winter squash, but it acts as a summer squash as well. So if you harvest it when it's really young and it's green, it tastes exactly like a zucchini. And then if you let it fully mature and harden like this one, it tastes just like butternut squash. So you just really get more bang for your buck with this squash. There are so many other varieties of Cucurbita machata, and I'm always looking for new ones to try. So if you're growing some that you really love, just drop it down in the comments. If you're struggling with other pests in the garden, be sure to check out our other pest prevention guides here. Good luck in the garden, good luck with those squash vine borers, and keep on growing.